How's it going, everybody? It's once again the beginning of the month, and that means it's time to set out for another lost world. Last month, I let everyone vote on which island would be added to the Patreon poll, and something rather interesting happened. We actually had a tie between the islands of Sicily and Malta, which during the Ice Age was one island, and the Isle of Flores. So we decided to go ahead and add both to the poll. As always, I released that poll on the 10th, and it went on for 1 week. And I have to say, I'm pretty surprised by the results. I was expecting either one of the two options I just mentioned, or Cuba to win for March, since Cuba is the location where the giant flightless owls that I mentioned last month, and got a bunch of people in the comments section in an uproar about. But instead, 31% of the voters decided to go with New Caledonia. And although I found this decision surprising, I definitely wasn't disappointed. Because if we're going to make a series called Lost Worlds, then this may actually be one of the best places on Earth to include. And for those of you who are still looking forward to any of the other islands I just mentioned, just remember that all 4 options from last month's poll will be remaining on that selection for next month's video. We're going to be continuing like this for a while, and I think I want to keep doing it like this, where I ask everyone in the community tab what locations I should be adding to the Patreon poll for the patrons to vote on. And if you want to have a final decision in the first video of every month, come join our Patreon. But with all that out of the way, it's time to return to the land that we last visited when covering the history of the land crocs. This remote island is unfortunately where that story concluded. But there is an entire amazing ecosystem that the Mesozoics were only just one part of. An ecosystem that, although it has been altered to a devastating degree today, still maintains some of the bizarre and unique species that once lived alongside these crocodiles. So let's check out the lost world of Pleistocene and early Holocene, New Caledonia. If you look at the geological history of New Caledonia, you see that this place has all the ingredients to be one of these lost time capsules of evolutionary experiments. The handful of islands that make up this archipelago are actually part of the Zealandia continental plate, a mostly submerged continent under the Pacific Ocean. This plate separated from Australia somewhere between 79 and 85 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. And it is unknown and still debated exactly how much of this plate was above sea level at that time. But this was the beginning of the fracturing of the great old southern landmass of Gondwana. Now, there's a lot that we don't know about Cretaceous Zealandia, and may never know, because much like Antarctica to the far south, Zealandia to the far east would not fare well as a continent on its own. For 30 million years, it remained as a time capsule for many different organisms that managed to survive since the Mesozoic. Despite the dinosaurs disappearing here just like everywhere else, many groups, especially plants from the forgotten supercontinent, still remained. And they would start to evolve in their own unique ways. But by 55 million years ago during the Eocene, we know that the sea had definitely started to claim however much of Zealandia was above the ocean. And this would mark the formation of the islands that we now call New Caledonia, along with the last time that it had any contact with another landmass directly, that being the southern region of Zealandia, which would form the islands of New Zealand. And this would send these two archipelagos down 2 different paths of evolution. And one day I would definitely love to cover the other half of this story, but today we're focusing here. And over the tens of millions of years that these islands would spend in isolation, it would become a world all its own. Because these islands have spent so much time in isolation, by the time we get to the Holocene, there was a bounty of endemic species to New Caledonia. And I should stop here and explain, for those who don't know, that the term endemic means exclusive to one place in the world. Moving forward in this video, and likely this entire series, that will be an important word to remember. As I already mentioned, the vegetation to this day makes this island look like something straight out of the Mesozoic. So much so, in fact, that this location has been chosen for filming the backdrop for many different paleo documentaries, such as Walking with Dinosaurs. But despite their primeval appearance, these plants have not remained entirely unchanged for 55 million years. They would adapt to two drastically different climates on the 16,000 square kilometer landmass of the main island, which is called Grand Terre. This massive disparage between different climates would literally be divided right down the middle of the island, and caused by something that we've discussed before, a mountain range that goes right down the center. And with rains that come from the east, the rain shadow effect created by the mountains makes for a wet rainforest covered east coast and an arid scrub forest west coast. These two environments have given the plant life many opportunities to adapt to different conditions, and the results are truly awe-inspiring. One of my favorites is a type of coastal plant that may appear at first to be a palm tree, but this is in fact a case of convergent evolution, because these plants in the genus Cyathea intermedia are actually a species of fern, and in taking this evolutionary direction, they became the tallest ferns in the world. In addition, there are 43 species of tropical gymnosperms that exist nowhere else on Earth, such as the conifer Parastaxis, which is the only known parasitic gymnosperm. This species actually lacks roots at all and have evolved to rely on attaching themselves to other members of their family to survive. The plants themselves are a whole other world here. And there are so many species that are so bizarre compared to what we see anywhere else that I feel like if I tried to cover too many of them, this video would be way too long. But the last plant that I want to mention is a genus of angiosperm known as Amborellia. This small shrub grows exclusively on Grand Terre and is actually the most basal genus in the clade of angiosperms, giving us a possible glimpse of what flowering plants may have been like around when they first evolved 130 million years ago. With all these remarkable habitats making up New Caledonia, I'm sure it's not at all surprising that the animals here would be equally unique. For one thing, because of the fact that these islands have been separated from every large landmass since the Cretaceous, mammals never had the chance to establish themselves as the dominant organisms following the extinction of the dinosaurs. The only mammals with any hope of making it here at all would be ones that could fly or swim. So, instead of the mammals, the remnant islands of Zealandia would become a haven for reptiles and birds. And when it comes to the birds, I don't even know where to begin. Actually, you know what? I do know where to begin. Let's start with a pigeon, known as the metallic pigeon for its shiny iridescent feathers, or the white-throated pigeon for that spot right there. Now, other than its dazzling plumage, this seems like a relatively unassuming bird. But what's interesting about this one is that it's actually not endemic to New Caledonia. It's actually quite widespread, living in the tropical forests of eastern Indonesia, the Philippines, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa, and the surrounding Southwest Pacific Islands, including New Caledonia. And when it first arrived here, it would likely have seen things that it had never seen before, probably first setting foot on the arid west coast. And the first thing that this newcomer would notice is that this place was absolutely crawling with skinks. Lizards are one of the most successful groups of reptiles on the island, and especially on the western half, the skinks in particular are by far the most diverse. But they would not be alone, for our shiny pigeon guide is not the only avian here. As we explore the shrubland and dry forest of the western half of the island, we would encounter such characters as the New Caledonian friarbird and the pile builder magopode, the latter being a pheasant-sized animal that was largely flightless and made large nests on the ground as its name suggests. Also at ground level would be the lowland kagu, an absolutely bizarre flightless bird that is only one of two species in a family that can trace its roots directly back to Eocene Zealandia. And today, only exist on New Caledonia. And with all these different small creatures eating insects, seeds, and berries, there would of course be carnivores that adapt to hunt them. And here, the most successful group of predators were the goshawks. Several different species adapt to prey on various birds and skinks throughout the dry forest. There were two species in particular that stood out. One for its power and the other for its speed and maneuverability. Creatively named the powerful goshawk and the gracile goshawk. The powerful goshawk had more robust legs and talons than most others, and it used these adaptations to hunt the larger ground-dwelling birds like the lowland kagu and the magapode. And smaller birds like finches would be constantly harassed by the gracile goshawk. One strategy to survive that small birds took advantage of was forming a symbiotic relationship with what was undoubtedly the most well-defended New Caledonian resident, a species of turtle known as Zealandia. And this thing was taking a winning strategy out of the same playbook as ankylosaurs and glyptodonts. Its armored back came standard for a turtle, but in addition, it had a long, dragging tail with spikes on it that it could use as a defensive weapon, and large spikes on its head. This animal looked downright prehistoric. And it almost seems like overkill, doesn't it? Having all these defenses and weapons to beat back goshawks? That's probably why small birds would gravitate towards this thing. If they helped get rid of parasites on Zealandia, they would get a free meal, plus they would get to ride around on what is essentially an armored tank covered in spikes. But still, it seems like there's a missing piece to this puzzle.
Yeah, just so you know, it's never good when he says that.
As we follow the pigeon spread across New Caledonia, we cross the mountains and come to the lush tropical forest. Some of the wildlife here is familiar from the other side, with finches and many other birds being equally well adapted to both the dry and wet forests. But there are also many new faces. For one thing, the parrots, like the New Caledonian parakeet and the horned parakeet. These and several others make up a huge amount of the avian fauna here. And although there are several skink species in the rainforest half of the island as well, there's a different group of dominant lizards here. This is the land of the geckos, including the largest species of gecko to ever live as far as we know, the New Caledonian giant gecko. These guys can grow over 43 centimeters long, or more than 1.5 feet, but there are also tons of more modestly sized ones. Like the species that most of you are probably most likely to be familiar with on this entire island, the crested gecko. The skinks and the geckos seem to have a perfect arrangement on this island. Skinks, generally speaking, tend to prefer more arid environments, while geckos tend to prefer more wet tropical environments. Besides there being a little bit of overlap here and there from a few species, this has allowed both groups to explode and populate the entire main island of Grande Terre. But if we come down to the forest floor, we would encounter the largest animal of New Caledonia. The 1.6 meter tall, 40 kilogram Sylviornis. This completely flightless bird is thought to have been a slow-moving browser that may have inhabited both sides of the island, but probably preferred the wider variety of food provided by the rainforest. It's part of the same order as birds like turkeys, chickens, quail, and other landfowl. But at the size of a cassowary, it was the biggest member of this order ever discovered. Among all these bizarre animals, any newcomers that arrived here would spread to these different biomes and diversified into many different forms. And that would be the fate of our pigeon friend. The original species would still remain, but they would also adapt into new species here that exist nowhere else other than New Caledonia. In the rainforest, they would get larger, evolving into the New Caledonian ground dove and Goliath imperial pigeon. And in the dry and tropical forest, they would become the most beautiful species of pigeon that I have ever seen. The cloven feathered dove. Look at this thing. It's a green pigeon The goshawks were also a common hunter of the tropical forests as well, but here they would be dethroned as the apex predator of the island by the meter-long land crocodiles that we've talked about before, the Mesozoics. These would be the only semi-large terrestrial carnivores on New Caledonia. And now that we've gone over the world that the Mesozoic calls home, it makes a lot more sense why it would evolve to climb trees. When the main thing to eat are birds and largely arboreal lizards, crocodilian will always adapt to go where the food is. In fact, both Mesozoic and Meolania are actually animals who managed to get here after Zealandia split from Gondwana. They both have their roots in the Australian mainland, and both had cousins that were far larger and more impressive there until around 40,000 years ago. And as we said in the history of the land crocs, it is unknown if humans were directly responsible for the extinction of animals like Quincana and the species of Meolania that could grow up to 3 times larger than the ones on New Caledonia. But what is not really debated at all is that humans had an effect on what was about to happen on this isolated island. The creatures of New Caledonia are the ultimate embodiment of the insular habitat equation. With up to 55 million years of isolation, evolution has been able to go in all sorts of weird and wonderful directions. We have several originally small species who grew noticeably larger to fit more powerful roles higher in the food chain. And we also have several later arrivals that got smaller than their mainland cousins. However, this story takes place much more recently than the previous island that we explored. And eventually, as we get into the Holocene, there was an inevitable wave of invaders on the horizon. The first humans arrived on New Caledonia around 1600 BCE. These were the Neolithic people of the Lepita culture. For this island of birds and reptiles, a new mammalian predator was more than many of them could handle. However, I do want to stress the point here that I do not feel like this is a case of humans being overly destructive. These people were simply trying to survive in a new environment. But the unfortunate truth is that this island was never going to be ready for an invasion of any large mammals. Before this, the only mammals at all on the interior of the island were fruit bats. And sadly, islands are just more susceptible to these types of situations when they finally come ashore. This first wave of humans would claim many of the biggest and most unique animals. Sylviornis, Mesozoic, Meolania, the powerful goshawk, and many others would all perish within a few hundred years of the arrival of the Lepita culture. But this was only the beginning. Although it was too late for some, the Lepita did eventually learn to live alongside the creatures of New Caledonia. When humans first arrive in a new location, it can be pretty bad, but that's nothing compared to when Western civilization arrives. And again, it's not that Western civilization comes to a new land. It's primarily a lot of the things that we bring with us. Things like cats, rats, dogs, pigs, goats, cows. All these mammals that have never been introduced to these islands before. These animals are like mankind's horsemen of the apocalypse, because everywhere we go, we take them, either on purpose or just because they hitch a ride. And they wreak absolute havoc on the endemic life that has no evolutionary defense against them. Explorer James Cook was the first European to set eyes on this mysterious land on September 4th, 1774. And after many false starts, it became a French penal colony in 1864. Why did it take 90 years? Well, there were some minor hiccups, like a group of missionaries in 1849 being killed and eaten by a clan of natives who practiced cannibalism. Which, I guess is one way to make sure that nobody escapes your prison. Like, yeah, you want to try to escape? Go ahead and run. There's the door. But inevitably, as all these different cultures began to arrive here, this lost world would be changed forever. As we come to the modern day, many of the animals of New Caledonia are already extinct. and countless more are vulnerable or endangered. For one example, the crested gecko, which is the second most kept pet gecko on Earth, only after the leopard gecko in popularity, was actually believed to be extinct in the wild until it was rediscovered in 1994. However, because of the widespread pet trade in Europe and North America, there are now more of these lizards in captivity than in the wild. And one day, it may be the only way that these animals exist. However, there is one animal endemic to this island that has seemed to do just fine since humans arrived. And I would argue that it might actually be one of the most remarkable. This unassuming black bird, the New Caledonian crow. Now, in the past 2 decades, we have started to learn about the absolutely remarkable level of intelligence of corvids. We've learned that they're actually right up there with the likes of other primates, cetaceans, cephalopods, and any other group of animals that we usually associate with higher levels of intelligence. Some tests have even suggested that crows and ravens may be every bit as capable of solving problems as a 7-year-old child. Well, as it turns out, many of these tests have been administered to different species of crows. And what appears to be the smartest of the corvids in terms of tool use, tool creation, and problem solving appears to be the New Caledonian crow, making this possibly among the smartest birds on Earth. Honestly, if I ever branch out into videos about still living animals, crows would be near the top of my list because I find them absolutely fascinating. But at this point, this script has already turned out to be a doozy, so I think I'll cut it off here. I want to thank my patrons for voting on this video, as well as being part of the team that allows me to do this for a living. If you would like to join the ranks of the Army of the Goo, check out my link in the description. But even if you can't afford to do that, just by liking and commenting, you will be helping promote the channel and continue to make content like this available for everyone. Alright, that's all I have for today. Have a good one, everybody.